Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we have with us Jim Lewis, who is one of the world's top cyber experts. You head the cyber program here at CSIS. I want to get to your report about hacking. When you look at the cyber skills shortage, I want to also ask you about Hillary Clinton's emails, but I want to start off with Donald Trump called on Russia to more broadly hack Hillary Clinton's emails. That's at least according to the New York Times. What are the implications of that, of an American presidential candidate asking a foreign power to hack the email of a former First Lady, presidential candidate, and Secretary of State?
Can I make a plea to the American voters, which is that there's a difference between reality and reality TV. Reality TV is rigged. They get the outcomes they want, and that's the world Donald Trump lives in. Reality is the Russians are not on our side. They are opposing us. They are out to get us, and you don't want to get too cozy with them. So when I see this, I think to myself, reality and reality TV. Reality TV is nice, but it's not the real world. In the real world, you don't ask the Russians to hack people's email.
How dangerous are the Russians? I mean, as somebody who's studied this field for decades as you have, how dangerous are the Russians and how good are their capabilities?
So I have a dispute with friends at the Department of Defense about whether the Russians are the best in the world, which they dispute, or whether they're as good as us. But that's what we're talking about. I believe the Russians are the best in the world. Their top teams are undetectable, and they use criminal groups to support government activities. Some of those criminal groups are better than most countries when it comes to hacking. So we are talking about the top of the league when you talk about Russia.
Jim, tell us a little bit, before we get to your report about the skills gap, skills shortage that exists in the cyber industry and the cyber world in general. I want to ask you a little bit about the DNC, the hack of the DNC emails. Obviously, right. That's a top issue. There are allegations that the Russians were involved. Walk us through the separate sort of cyber incidents here that are all being sort of conjoined into one group, and also what we think happened and what the importance of it is.
The Russians are among the best in the world when it comes to hacking, and they have previously hacked the 2008 DNC and RNC databases, and I believe the 2012. So this is not unusual. It's a goldmine for intelligence on the people you might be facing in government. They've done it before. What they haven't done is they haven't leaked the information. And they hacked the Bundestag last year, the German parliament. Didn't see any leaks from that. So the Russians hacking into political databases, what else is new? You can be confident that it was them. The Russians then turning around and leaking the data, that would be a bold move. And I'm not yet sure we have the evidence to say conclusively they're the ones behind the leak.
But what is the importance of it if it is linked to the Russians? And some are suggesting, some even in intelligence circles are saying that, look, however it got from the Russians to, for example, WikiLeaks, right. They were the guys who did it. Right. What's the importance of the disclosure of that information, timed as it was? Julian Assange has admitted that he did it deliberately to come during the convention. Right. There are those who say that there are going to be more disclosures, time for debates and other things. What's the importance of this entering, this sort of next step in cyber war, if you will?
Well, Julian Assange is a pimp, and so he's perfectly willing to be used if it A, gets him some attention, and B, just causes destruction. He had no positive goals in this, and his intent was to disrupt without any benefit to anyone on the planet other than himself. And maybe the Russians. They clearly benefited. This is consistent with their practice in manipulating politics in their own country, this kind of leak. So it could have been them, but WikiLeaks, boy, what a bunch of losers. To quote a presidential candidate.
What's the sort of? But now that we know that, and there's so much ample evidence that the Russians are doing this sort of activity, Chinese are. It's not to say the United States isn't doing it, but sure. But we tend not to, I think, disclose the way that this sort of thing is happening. But what are if the United States, as the world's leading power, is subject to these sort of intrusions, what does the whole system have to do to guard itself against, A, making that information available, or B, writing it down in a locked safe if it has to be?
This shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone. And so one of the standard jokes in this is if it's an unclassified network, it's probably been hacked, if anyone has any interest in hacking it. So no one should be surprised. What do you need to do to fix that is something we've been talking about for a long time. One of the different things now is, in some cases, given the shortage of workforce, given the difficulty of doing this, given the cost, people might want to think about managed services. So buy your email service from one of the big companies that provides it. They're going to do a better job. They're going to pay for security in a way that a little company or an ad hoc group like a Democratic Party or a Republican Party, they're not going to be able to match. So build the workforce, move to managed services, and then work on getting people in other countries to believe there are lines they should not cross. We had to do that with Sony. We had to do that with SANS to some extent and GitHub. It looks like we may need to do it again. There are lines you should be afraid to cross.
Let me take you to your, speaking of lines and the skill sets that are required to maintain that level of excellence. You and your team studied the skills gap, the skills shortage that exists. Talk us a little bit about the study. You went to 8 countries around the world where you guys put a survey out. What are sort of the core findings of that?
It was interesting because when you do a survey, you don't always know what you're going to get, right? And so we got, everyone thinks there's a shortage. Okay, not a surprise.
Oh, and we should say the countries are Australia, Israel.
Australia, Israel, the UK, Mexico, the US. You're going to embarrass me here. Was it Canada,
What?
France? Anyhow.
Those are the big guys.
Yeah. It was mainly Japan. So it was mainly big markets. Places where you have most of the cybersecurity activity. What we found that was surprising is that 3/4 of the respondents said that the shortage of cybersecurity skills directly affected their company, made them a more likely target to be hacked, and had in some instances, 3/4 of them said, we were hacked because we didn't have enough people and it hurt the company's brand. It meant a loss of intellectual property. The linkage between a worker shortage and damage to the company was interesting. Some of the other stuff, again, not necessarily a surprise. People felt that traditional education didn't equip employees with the skills they need. They said that the things that were most useful were experience, no surprise there. The kind of certifications you can get in cybersecurity, that was a good hint. And the one we didn't expect was they said gaming. Gaming experience, gaming skills, that was one of the things that made a good cybersecurity worker. So the direct link to damage and the skills you need to actually be a good cybersecurity worker, those were some of the unexpected results and some of the interesting ones. The diversity part, it looks like diverse teams are stronger than monoculture teams. So we kind of expected that, but it was nice to have it confirmed.
It's a twofold question. The first is, what do folks do in the interim to bridge this gap of skilled talent? How do you address that? And then what are the policies? Well, let's start there, and I'll go to the policy question.
Well, some of it is, we found that there's a pay differential, right? So people are competing for these scarce bodies, and that means a little more money. Hopefully, over time, that will attract people into the field. Some of the things you can do is you can move to managed services. You can look for technology that you can use as a stopgap until you got the workers in place. So a lot of interest, and this is traditional economics. You're balancing labor and capital goods. And in the short term, people might need to pay a little more on capital goods while that labor force gets built. In the long term, what people came to is government emphasis. The countries that did the best were places that had strong cybersecurity industries. They felt that government attention and spending on this was important. And they also felt that modernizing curricula at universities would be important. Some of the respondents were pretty frank about how a degree in computer science doesn't make you a cybersecurity expert unless that degree has focused on cybersecurity. So we need some curriculum reform.
Do you think that there should be, just as the government did, after Sputnik was launched, which is to give tax breaks and other incentives to get people into engineering, for example, when we were sort of starting off the space program, do we need some form of kind of a national program to make it sort of generally more attractive, not just on a corporate side and on a salary side, but sort of to encourage folks to go into these fields?
But not just for cybersecurity, for science and engineering across the board. We need to duplicate that pardon me. We need to duplicate that post-Sputnik program, and we need to do it seriously. We're not talking about onesies and twosies and a couple $1 million here and a couple $1 million there. We need that kind of post-Sputnik program to rebuild America's technological base, including cybersecurity.
And let me ask you one last thing. You said about curriculum changes that are going to be needed. There are advertisements on TV, actually, you're seeing about how like the high school and American education system really hasn't evolved very much in centuries in some cases. What are some of the specific reforms that have to happen, you think, across the curriculum to bolster America's science and engineering skills?
The part that came out from the surveys was that people felt that you really needed to focus in on pragmatic things you can do to improve security, and whether that's secure coding or experience in red teaming, in penetration testing, those are the skills that need to be taught. So you need to have a kind of more of an operational focus. It's not the whole degree, of course, but some of what you need to learn has to have this operational focus. And we heard from Candace, one of the speakers.
Candace Worley, who is with Intel Security.
That when they tried a couple experimental classes, I think it was at Stanford, students lined up around the block to take these classes. So we know there's demand both from the people who want bodies and the people who want training to have this kind of proactive, pragmatic curriculum as part of the larger computer science degree.
Jim, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.